Kim Snyder, and thank you so much for joining me for the Sane Crypto Podcast, the first cryptocurrency podcast for baby boomers investing for retirement. Most people believe crypto assets are too risky for the average investor. I believe the risk is in not investing, and in fact, cryptocurrency may be the answer to near retirees' prayers. The Sane Crypto Mastermind is my signature program for those who want the diversification benefits and return potential of cryptocurrency, but can't, won't, or don't have the time, frankly, to figure this all out and keep up with it on their own. If you'd like to learn more, I'd encourage you to join my free online training, how a little bit of Bitcoin can make your retirement savings go a lot further, at sanecrypto.com/retirement. Like many of you, I suspect, I listen to a lot of podcasts on a lot of different topics. I probably listen to, I'd say, at least 3 hours worth of podcasts per day. Some days more, some days less, very few of them, incidentally, about cryptocurrency. But one crypto podcaster that I do listen to regularly is Laura Shin. And I was very intrigued by a quick discussion about Bitcoin as a hedge against inflation and recession on her Unconfirmed podcast last night. She's got two. This one was on Unconfirmed. I'll put the link in the show notes. She was interviewing Dan McArdle from Messari about a couple of different topics. Tether breaking its dollar peg. What I think is a huge piece of news in that Fidelity is the mainstream brokerage firm. Fidelity is going all in on crypto. That's big. And then just at the end, she asked Dan about a series of tweets he had written about how Bitcoin would react in a recession.
Yeah. So speaking about kind of like interest and demand in Bitcoin, I know that you also have been having some interesting thoughts around how Bitcoin could behave in a recession. What's your thesis there?
Yeah. Basically, I think it's more nuanced than a lot of people tend to assert. I think there's this general opinion that, because Bitcoin is, fundamentally disconnected from the rest of the financial system, that, somehow that necessarily means that it would, outperform in a recession.
So just reading directly from his tweets would probably be the easiest way to give you his full take. He says, 1, Bitcoin is a hedge against inflation and loss of confidence in fiat, not a hedge against a typical recession. 2, its value over the long haul stems from inflation resistance, being able to function as money if confidence in fiat is lost, and inability for banks/governments to seize it. 3, in the short run, it's mostly a speculative asset. So in the liquidity crunch of a typical recession, people will sell Bitcoin to pay off fiat-denominated debts, bills, etc. 4, I think many people have this generic notion that Bitcoin is a hedge against traditional markets, and they intuitively think that means it'll perform well in a recession. 5, I think that's probably false. We saw this with gold in 08-09. It tanked. What subsequently led to gold's 2011 all-time high run was people wanting to hedge European and other fiat collapse scenarios. 6, same dynamic seems likely with Bitcoin. Sell-off under liquidity crisis scenarios, ramp on sovereign debt fiat confidence crises. So this topic has been getting a bit of discussion lately. Not just me, but you'll recall if you listen to this podcast or if you've attended any of my free trainings that I have a somewhat similar view. I think that there are 3 really compelling reasons to have Bitcoin in your portfolio. One is that it is a non-correlated asset to the other assets that you would typically hold in a traditional portfolio. Two is that it is this hedge against hyperinflation and a financial crisis, as he points out. And that three, it is an asymmetric bet, meaning it has a huge upside, very much like buying a call option or a venture capital investment, where your downside is limited to the amount invested, but the upside is potentially massive, but definitely not guaranteed. So generally, I think I agree with most of what Dan is saying here. But just as he says he thinks his view is more nuanced than most people's, which is almost certainly true, I think mine is even maybe a little more nuanced even than his. So first of all, understand where I'm coming from, which may or may not be the same place he is. I am coming from the perspective of a diversified portfolio whose job is to fund 40 plus years in retirement, in which cryptocurrency is, for now, still a very small but important portion of the overall allocation for the reasons that I just gave you. Now, where we totally agree, I think, is around Bitcoin as a hedge against hyperinflation, fiat currency crisis, that sort of thing. I think it's reasonable to have a lot more confidence around how Bitcoin would act under those circumstances because, one, we have an expectation that it should perform that function given that it is just a digital form of gold. And two, we have anecdotal data. Even though Bitcoin hasn't been around that long, we actually have quite a lot of anecdotal data that it, in fact, does. Now, clearly, anecdotal data over a period of only 10 years is not, quite as rigorous as the, hundreds of years of evidence of gold, the physical gold, nor as rigorous as the academic studies of that we will have at some point in the future. But you can look at what's happened in Turkey, in Greece, in Zimbabwe, and Argentina, Venezuela, all these different places, and see how it has actually reacted. And in case you're wondering why it is a better gold than gold, why not just physical gold? Well, in those circumstances, it is because, as Dan said in his tweets, it can't be seized or confiscated. There are stories, for example, of Venezuelan officials at the airport in Caracas seizing the gold hidden in people's suitcases as they flee because the bolivar is absolutely worthless, okay? With Bitcoin, they can't do that. So we have data, we have anecdotal data that Bitcoin has already served this function in a limited subset of cases, and we have no reason to believe that it wouldn't do the same if the crisis were in the dollar or the euro versus the peso or the bolivar. The second point, which is that Bitcoin is a non-correlated asset and should therefore reduce risk in a portfolio of other non-correlated assets, is where I think further discussion is warranted. So first off, let's talk generally about correlated and non-correlated assets so that we're all on the same page. I think this distinction Dan made about people thinking that non-correlated means it will perform well in a recession is really interesting because that's not what non-correlated means at all. When two assets are non-correlated, and keep in mind that correlations do shift over time, but two assets that are non-correlated means they don't move up and down together and or by the same amounts. Their movements relative to one another appear to be random. So in other words, if you and I are both flipping a coin, heads our asset goes up and tails it goes down, there will definitely be times we both flip a string of tails in a row, and sometimes we will both flip a string of heads in a row, and other times we will be flipping things totally different. So the idea is that the more non-correlated assets you have, the more likely that some will be up and some down, and over time, they all balance out. And the shorter your investment time horizon, the more important this becomes because of something known as the sequencing of returns problem. When you're in growth mode, sequence of returns doesn't matter. Regardless of whether a portfolio experiences weak or strong returns early on, the ending market value will be exactly the same. But this is not the case once you begin taking distributions, when you have to live off of that portfolio. Given two portfolios with the exact same distributions and the exact same average return over time, the one that experiences lower returns early on can run out of money 20 years earlier. And that's bad, by the way, when you're trying to live off of that portfolio. And one more point about non-correlated assets. They're hard to come by. Over time, as we've become more globalized and, advances in technology, assets have become more and more correlated. We're used to, you could get diversification by just splitting your equities between growth and value, or domestic and foreign, developing and developed. Now, those are totally correlated, okay? Even different asset classes like bonds, real estate, and commodities are becoming more and more correlated over time. So, of course, if Bitcoin were to maintain the zero correlation with equities, which is what the bulk of U.S. wealth is in, that would be really, really helpful. Okay, so that's part of why it's so exciting. So with that as background, the other thread we need to pull is that, the threat is recession. It is a threat, but it's really interesting to me that this is where the conversation about non-correlated assets went. And hearing that was really useful, because as soon as he said it, I was like, oh, of course it did. But it didn't have to. I mean, that wasn't a foregone conclusion. I think recession is really just the boogeyman under the bed because of something known as recency bias. Meaning, we just had, in 2008, 2009, a horrible recession, the Great Recession, they call it here in the United States. And recency bias causes investors to worry about the wrong things. A recent article by Barry Ritholtz commented on this tendency to confuse risk with fear, quoting a Twitter wag who said, Kim Kardashian has been married to more Americans than the number of Americans killed by Ebola. Or to be a little less catty, probabilistically speaking, you are more likely to be killed by a toddler than a terrorist. So just like an entire generation was deeply affected by the Great Depression, you always hear people say, oh, my grandmother was really frugal. She was a child of the Depression. We haven't had a recurrence of the Great Depression in almost 100 years, knock wood, right? So while in a widespread, that's recency bias, by the way, So while in a widespread global recession that looks like the last one, Dan may very well be right. But remember, the next one is very unlikely to look like the last one, just as this one didn't look like anything like the one before it. And you also have to understand that there are a wide spectrum of events. It's a continuum ranging on one end from global financial crisis, which thankfully does happen very infrequently, all the way down to your run-of-the-mill bear market, which we expect to happen about once every 5 years in stocks, that diversification protects us against. So even if even if it's true that Bitcoin may not go up in a recession, it may not, but even if true, it doesn't mean that mathematically it isn't still better to hold those non-correlated assets than not. Here in the United States, we just had Hurricane Michael hit the panhandle of Florida, and a lot of the newspapers were talking about this big house. They call it the Hurricane House that was left standing right on Mexico Beach where the hurricane came ashore. And everything else around it is just leveled, right? So it looks crazy, this huge 5-bedroom, they call it the Sand Palace. And the owner said, that it cost him about 30% more to hurricane-proof it to 250 mile per hour winds. And even though the Hurricane House, the Sand Palace, sustained, some damage, a few windows blown out and, a little water damage on the bottom floor, it was mostly intact. It wasn't wiped out. And that's really the point of holding these diversified, non-correlated assets. Okay, does that make sense? All right. As always, I hope you found that helpful and thought-provoking. If it was, I have a big favor to ask you, which I'm sure you have heard me and other podcast hosts ask you for iTunes reviews. Those reviews tell the algorithm to show the podcast to more people by sending that all-important social signal to the algorithm that I'm producing quality content that my audience finds helpful. So if that is you and you do find it helpful, the way you can repay me is to take a moment to do 2 things. 1, to subscribe to the podcast, and 2, leave a 5-star rating and a review with comments and feedback like so many others of you have done. And if you are one of those, I appreciate you so much. I do read each and every one. Also, if you'd like to learn more about striking the right balance in your cryptocurrency investments and my system for doing that, I recommend my free online training, how a little bit of Bitcoin can make your retirement savings go a lot further, at sanecrypto.com/retirement. You can get the full show notes of this episode, including links to Laura Shin's podcast, any of the resources mentioned, Dan McArdle's original Twitter or tweet, and etc. Anything else at sanecrypto.com/podcast. And finally, if you've got a question about today's topic or anything else, just email me at askhim@sanecrypto.com. I read and answer every email personally, as well as answer some of them here on the show. Everything I say on this show is for educational purposes only. Nothing should be considered investment advice. Past performance is no guarantee of future results. All investments involve risk, so do not, under any circumstances, invest money you can't afford to lose. That is it for me. I am Kim Snyder, and I'll be back next week. Until then, may the crypto gods continue to smile on us all.